So, this is now session 6 of the overall conference, and this is devoted to the diaspora and the economy. And again, the ground rules for speakers are 15 minutes each, with very, very strict chairmanship. But I immediately make an exception for the first two speakers, because there's two of them, so they're allowed 8 minutes each.
Thank you very much.
So let's get started, and I think Anastasios Grigorakis is going first, and then Dimitris Kataiftsis.
Good morning. In this paper we're going to discuss some of the very first results of our ongoing postdoctoral research in the University of Macedonia. So every comment and feedback is more than welcome at this stage. We're going to discuss the development and transformation of the economic activities of the migrants of the former Soviet Union in the city of Thessaloniki. Between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the 20th century, more than 150,000 ethnic Greeks living in various regions of the former Soviet Union migrated to Greece. Though most of them had barely any ties to Greece, they considered Greece as an eternal homeland that now was the time to finally meet. The migration was mostly sudden and massive between 1990 and 1993, and it was a collective rather than an individual decision. This led to a large-scale family migration and finally to the complete relocation of kinship or locality-based networks. The majority of the immigrants, around 60% of the total, settled in Macedonia, and half of them stayed in Thessaloniki. Our choice to study northern Greece and Thessaloniki particularly resulted mainly from the importance of the migrant flows and the diasporic networks in this region, along with the fact that Thessaloniki is also the base of some notorious Greek Pontic big businessmen of the diaspora, like Ivan Savvidis and Boris Mouzenidis. This study is based on a number of interviews with migrants living in Thessaloniki, mostly arrived in Greece during the early 90s, which was the peak period of the migration flows from the former Soviet Union. The choice of the interviewees is based on the type of employment. We have focused on migrants that work on network-based activities in popular markets, construction sector, or Russian markets, or are employees in bigger companies of Pontic Greek businessmen. Our main argument here is that the way economic activities take place and change is affected by the structure of the diasporic networks of Pontic Greeks from the former Soviet Union, often forming transnational communities which exchange goods, information, and human resources in order to survive or to improve their economic social status. As part of livelihood and social reproduction strategies, some migrant families do not abandon their former identities, which they use in order to invest or to develop business activities between the two countries, and draw advantages from it, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of social protection and benefits. In this aspect, we second Mark Granovetter when he remarks that economy is not an atomized action outside its social context, but it's embedded in concrete and ongoing systems of social relations. At the same time, local economies are subject to the way migrants conceive and structure their relations with their peers, and to moral values and judgments about work, entrepreneurship, and livelihood. As Edward Thompson points out, individuals and social groups think and act according to a nexus of conceptions and beliefs about what is right or wrong, fair or unfair, justifiable or not. Therefore, all these social norms and obligations that underpin economic practices are also very important to us. Obviously, the economy of the diaspora cannot be seen as a separate entity from the national and international economy. If local economic activities are affected by the way diasporic networks are structured, they are also dependent on global economic transformations. So, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the mass flow of migrants in Greece, there were thousands of those who chose Thessaloniki as a region of settlement, mainly because members of their family or of their community were already there, but also for some economic reasons related to the opportunities that was offered in the labor market of the city. The very first diasporic networks played an important role in the first period upon arrival and achieved the normalization of life conditions. Solidarity networks that kept growing, informal or more organized ones, offered important economic support through loans or other exchanges. So a kind of moral community was formed, sharing resources in order to cope with poverty. During the 90s, the Ponti Greeks that stayed behind in post-Soviet democracies were often organizing solidarity missions, collecting foodstuff, sending packages to the poor compatriots in Greece, and the opposite. Migration relied heavily on family and kinship, notably during the very first period of settlement in Thessaloniki. The choice of place for settlement and the nature of economic activities depended on where family and relatives were already. These solidarity networks served also as a framework for some commercial activities. It is not surprising that kinship or friend relations were the base for developing companies of trust that led to work ethnic communities and new business networks. The solidarity partnerships soon created more extended business networks between former Soviet Union Greeks and those who stayed back in Russia and the Caucasus. As a result, commercial activity, especially in the late 90s, flourished. Nikos, who is one of our informants who came from Moscow in 1993 and settled in the Eptarophos suburb of Thessaloniki, where he had already family and some friends, as Nikos told us, these commercial activities are a characteristic of the collective identity of Ponti Greeks due to their cooperative spirit and partnership. This commercial spirit was kept alive inside them, according to him, during the communist era, and Greece, which was a market economy, was now a forward place to develop it. The fur and fruits markets were among the very early commercial activities, often informal, where many Ponti Greeks were implicated in northern Greece. However, commercial activities were highly dependent on the changes in national and international economy, and the goods for trade changed according to prices and profit margins. Another very important world ethnic community activity of the newcomers, not only in Thessaloniki but generally in Greece, were the popular markets. Many Ponti Greeks who sold their houses back in Russia transformed the amount they earned by selling their homes. These amounts were impossible to transfer to transport in Greece. It was also impossible to change in drachmas or dollars. So they transformed these amounts they earned to household goods like sheets or tablecloths, which they bought cheaply in the Russian market, and then started to sell them in the popular markets in Thessaloniki or elsewhere. Most of them were already informed on the conditions of the host country by family, kinship, or friend networks in Greece. According to Panayotis, another of our informants who started working in popular markets since 1990, these markets were not a proper commercial activity, but a survival one, mainly during the very first years of settlement of Ponti Greeks in Thessaloniki. However, the continuous activity of that type implies rather the contrary, as many of them transformed this survival strategy to a commercial one, returning back in order to buy and sell more products. Sellers visited Russia and other ex-Soviet republics individually and were searching for stock markets or warehouses in order to buy goods in a very low price. Often, these products were transported along with household effectives of families migrating in Greece in order to avoid customs declaration. The economic activity popular market started to decline when it ceased to be profitable, mainly because of the global economic transformation in Greece, Russia, and the other ex-Soviet republics. As Panayotis explained to us, during the new century, Russian and Eastern markets started to be stabilized, salaries were increased, and so did the price of goods. So nowadays, goods in Russia are often more expensive than in Greece. People who remained longer in popular markets soon followed similar but more profitable activities. The most important of them was the trade of various goods in the Panigyria, the local festivals, a seasonal and non-permanent activity. Apart from different types of popular markets, local groceries, bakeries, small restaurants that opened in all regions of settlement in western borders of Thessaloniki, the beginning and lately the explosion of Russian product stores is an important chapter in the historical framework of the economic activity of the Pontic Greeks.
Tassos, thank you very much. An excellent time.
It's 8 minutes?
8 minutes. On the button.
Okay. Russian markets, as a commercial institution in Greece, coincides with the various waves of Pontic Greek refugees of early 90s. Even so, the bigger explosion of them dates some years later, when an internal market composed by Russian-speaking people emerges. For Pontic Greeks who have been working in popular markets as a main occupation, the Russian product stores signified the professionalization of their business, a step forward, some kind of merchant capitalism, and a more stable environment for accumulating a modest capital. Russian product store mark a basic change in Pontic entrepreneurship, the Europeanization, Westernization of their business behavior, and the creation of a new market, at least in Thessaloniki, at least in the beginning. Starting from small delicatessen products in the suburbs with Pontic and Russian-speaking populations, Ruski Produkti chain stores soon appeared everywhere. If the first boutiques started with the modest of means, the development of this sector demanded a higher level of organization and alliances. The meat and sausage factory of Aspik, part of the Czech Chamber of Commerce, based near Kilkis, supplies many Russian product stores all over Greece. In its list of partners, Pontic names are the most frequent, like Kesidis, Papounidou, Hasiridis, Politidis, Javachalidis, Karabulatidis, and so on. That seems that there is a spectacular illustration of the enormous role of Pontic Greeks in this market. However, there could be no point seeking for any kind of monopoly over this market, since the major players are people not originating from the same ethnic group, but from broader networks. With major partners not from Russia, but from Germany, firms that emerged from post-Soviet and post-social diasporas who settled in Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, supply Greek stores that specialize in Russian, Armenian, Georgian, and Central Asian traditional tastes. One of the main characteristics of this market is the use of Russian language, which connects clients, employees, suppliers, and partners, and probably the key to be engaged in this sort of business. Part of a broader language lobby, Russian product stores managed to survive despite the general crisis Greece suffered. Additionally, they constituted a shield for protection towards the violent proletarization of local small-scale businesses, creating an internal market that engaged Russian-speaking employees and covering the food needs of customers who were ready to rediscover the tastes of their homeland. Directly related to the above, a question that emerged in these 2 months of our rudimentary research had to do with its object. Are we studying Pontic Greeks as an ethnic diaspora or a wider community of Russian-speaking citizens which act in a broader network of post-Soviet European diasporas? If we start analyzing Ivan Savidis and Boris Mouzhenidis' cases, we will recognize a multi-level reality, since the language seems to play a crucial, but not the sole role in the organization of diasporas networks. The relation of Ivan Savidis with the Pontic Greek diaspora networks is partly symbolic, with less economic dimensions, if we put aside the politics of charities. A Russia-based businessman who invested in Greece, in the press sector, in real estate, the football, cannot be considered as a prominent member of Pontic diaspora in northern Greece. It is, however, surprising the cult of personality on him developed by Pontic Greek communities in all over the world, product of his supposed commitment to traditional Pontic values as religion, patriotism, hard work, and honesty. On the other hand, Boris Mouzhenidis has conserved more close affinities with the main body of Pontic Greek diaspora of northern Greece. Having started almost from zero, his achievements in business activity are highly recognized for several reasons among the Pontic communities. His cult of personality among his employees is nourished by the assumption that he is self-made and very, very clever. According to one of them, also a member of Mouzhenidis' family tree, he came from Georgia to Greece holding just a suitcase. He started to work in popular markets, but soon he followed commercial activity. He went to Athens, where he got into cargo and shipping business. Then he started thinking clever and predicted the tourists coming from Russia in mid-90s, something that pushed him into tourist business. From that point on, he's giving job to thousands of people. This is the words of one of his employees. Since Boris Mouzanidis came from the deeps of Thessaloniki's Pontic Greek diaspora, the main source of his workforce remains these communities even today. The ties with them are still strong. One emerging question is whether the choice of people from these communities is purely instrumental, since they are all bilingual, mastering both Russian and Greek language. We remark that in Mouzanidis' case, as well as Mrs. Natalia's store of Russian products, this is the main characteristic. However, this would be a simplistic view of Boris Mouzanidis' case for many reasons. The first has to do with working ethics and the banality according to which Pontic Greeks were considered or rumored to be hardworking far more than the locals. And that maybe was the reason that employees from the Pontic Greek community had been given preference, at least in the beginning. Secondly, far more important than the Pontic cultural identity and knowledge of Russian language are kinship relations. Many white collars in his business are chosen on that base, and it is not surprising either the appearance of surnames that belong to the same genealogical tree in the high ranks of his group of companies. Devoted or not to the boss, members of the extended family have the chance to be found in business hierarchies that would never have the chance to be found in such an easy way in another Greek firm, local Greek firm. The third reason is related to an hypothesis under which, through the exclusive use of Russian language, closed markets are created in which entrepreneurs like Mouzanidis want to set the limits and control completely. However, this is an argument that requires a more profound research. It is easily recognizable that forms of economic reproduction that were examined here are not the only, neither they cover the whole range of professional activities of Pontic Greek migrants from the FSU countries. They compose, however, the framework in which moral values and traditional attitudes come into conflict with economic indicators and capitalist ethics from early 90s until nowadays. The gradual emergence of capitalist activities within the diaspora and the englobing economic changes and crises transform the way members of the community exchange and work without, however, totally disembed the economy of the diaspora from the social, symbolic, and economic implications of belonging to the Greek Pontic community. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. Right, Aymeric Faure, getting us onto the subject of remittances, which I know is very important.
So, good morning everyone. So, I'm here to present a paper we prepared with Manolis Patsinakis that cannot be here today. So, it's about remittances and to understand why the remittances decreased, whereas the number of immigrants, Greek immigrants, increased. So, let's start. I think I will start by put some stones in the ground, so migrants and trades, remittances, trends, crisis, the person to solve on the methodology. So on this aspect, I think you had like a lot of insight yesterday about the migration waves that Greece experienced. So there are three. The first one in the.
There is a request to switch off the light so we can.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
okay?
it's the third switch on the right in that panel there.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So the first wave happened at the beginning of the 20th century, the second in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the last one after the 2009 crisis. The demography of the newest immigration wave seems to be different according to recent studies conducted by Manolis Patsinakis and Adonis Labrianidis and Gropas and Triandafilidou in 2014 and 2016. And this is a graph extracted from Manolis and Labrianidis' paper, which shows that the education level of the immigrant changed drastically after progressively since the end of the 60s. So people who immigrate now are graduates, either postgraduates whereas the previous waves were made of people with high school diploma or lower education, and behind that, their economic level was different as well. Concerning the remittances, as evidenced by Karafolas, after the 80s, the remittances of the Greek diaspora were particularly important for the national economy. According to the World Bank data, remittances inflows stood at around 1.5 and even 2% of the Greek GDP from 1960 to 2001.
Are these net or gross?
What?
The remittances are net or gross?
Net. Lianos in 1997 reported that remittances came mainly from the US and Germany, which were the two countries with the highest number of immigrants from Greece. Thus, in 1982, remittances from Germany represented, even just Germany, representing 1% of the Greek GDP. However, since 2009, remittances represent only 0.35% of GDP in average, and reaching even 0.17% in 2016. So it's a significant decrease that must be explored. And on this graph, you can see that the immigration rate, the immigration that increased importantly, and the remittances in the black line decreasing. So some I went too fast. So some insight of the crisis, the impact of the 2009 crisis is to be analyzed as a combined effect of structural and conjectural factors. Greece faced a long-run structural weakness of institution, administration and economic sector. The labor market and the educational system were unbalanced even before the crisis, resulting in a large amount of overqualified Greek citizens. This imbalance was not the result of a supposedly excessively highly skilled workforce, but rather in the demand side of the labor market failing to absorb this workforce. The crisis has had violent social and economic effects, devastating Greek economic and social systems, and this context is supposed to have generated, or at least reinforced, the immigration behavior of Greek people. Then this leads to the puzzle we have to solve. We have those trends that are evidenced and the counter-cyclicality assumption of remittances. Historically, remittances appear to be stable and even counter-cyclical. They tend to rise in times of financial crisis, in times of financial crisis, as the objective of the diaspora is to help their family back home to face the crisis. This happened in 1995 during the Mexico financial crisis, and also in the Philippines and Thailand after the Asian financial crisis in 1997. And on this graph, you can see that remittances are one of the most resilient and counter-cyclical and robust flows of external money. Then our methodology is this is important. Sorry. I go back here. We can see that in the graph we have two effects. The first one is that it's a value effect, showing that the remittances of the old diaspora did not increase and decrease. Even though the number of immigrants have been stable, the remittances decrease in any ways. So there's a value effect, and there's a volume effect, because even all the new immigrants do not remit. So those two effects that we have to understand and to explore. So to assess those effects, we combine two approaches. To understand the effect of the crisis on the old diaspora, we conducted a statistical analysis based on macro data to study the factors that generated a change in Greek immigrants' remittance behavior. And this was followed by a comparison with similar data concerning other 1,000 European countries that also experienced the crisis and emigration waves. Concerning the new diaspora, we developed, and the new diaspora is the biggest part of our research, and we developed a micro model based on data from the EU Migra survey conducted on Greeks in the UK and the Netherlands. So, let's start by the first part, the established diaspora, the old diaspora and the macro model. So in 2013, Collier highlighted that the immigrant participation through remittances, knowledge transfer, investment, or even return migration in a contemporary post-territorial state is synonymous with trust. Trust is a relation involving two parts, one of each being vulnerable to the other. In exchange to submission to the parliament and to the institution of the country, the states must act in accordance with citizens' expectations. In 2009, the trigger happened when Papandreou's administration announced that official public figures were manipulated in the past, and this fueled the already existing sentiments of corruption, clientelism, and nepotism that have been emphasized by the crisis. Trust between the Greek people and the administration is affected, and many studies like Rouganas and Skilias, Gius-Mpasoglu show the disillusion of Greeks in the homeland as well as in Greeks abroad. Thus, we believe that the diminution of remittances sent by the Greeks abroad is positively correlated with the degree of trust in the political and institutional system.
Aymeric, 5 minutes.
So we measure trust into political institution and administration, combining 4 indicators from the Eurobarometers, assessing confidence in national political system, corruption, confidence in national institution, and confidence in external actors like the European Union or international organization. We evidence that there is a large positive and statistically significant correlation between this variable and the amount of remittances sent. For 1 unit decrease of trust in the Greeks in the political system and institutions, remittances received per capita decreased by 0.75 units. Let's go. I need to run, sorry. So the second model, so going against the general perception, the richer the immigrants, the higher remittances. Faure in 2007 evidenced that expatriates tend to remit less when the socio-economic support is not necessary, and that families that already have a convenient economic and social situation in the homeland don't need to receive remittances. This graph is showing the relationship between the educational level of the immigrants in the x-axis and the per capita remittance in the y-axis. It now contrary to these previous immigration waves, the post-crisis immigration wave seems to have a different composition. It concerns high-skilled people, and then the recent survey attempt to draw this demographic, and we talked about that yesterday. And the crisis strongly increased the average cost of migration, and graduates who were already more equipped to migrate can still afford to immigrate. So we hypothesized that, along with Faure's work, that the higher the economic and social background of the immigrant, the lower the remittances will be. So this is the results of our research. So we conducted 9 binary logistic regressions, each one emphasizing different aspects between, I don't have time, so personal factors, economic factors, familial factors, and non-economic factors, and we mixed each time 1, 2, 3, 4, it's one each, and then 5 is 2 of them, 2 of them, 2 of them, and the ninth model is a combination of all of them. So the results suggest the existence of 2 groups of contemporary immigrants. The first one comprises people from a lower educational level and from a vulnerable economic background that emigrated for survival purposes, and we can see that in all models with the rhythmic survival variable, which is always statistically significant. The probability to remit increases from 0.75 or 0.85, depending on the models, if survival is cited as a reason to emigrate. This is in line with the theory. Their family has been hardly hit by the crisis, and they immigrated having in mind the need to remit to support the family back home. But there is a second group, made of people from a high familial educational background and whose household economic level is better resisted to the crisis. The most stable and resilient to the crisis, the economic level of the household, and the lowest, the probability to remit. A decrease of between 0.63 to 0.79 according to the models. Moreover, the educational level of at least of one of the two parents of the Greek emigrants is negatively correlated with remittances, which means that the higher the educational level, the lower likelihood to remit.
Aymeric, just 1 minute.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump to the
Sorry.
conclusive remarks. Even though the analysis of the old diaspora is still at its first steps and deserves the greater attention, the main finding is that the old diaspora changed behavior with regard to the situation in the home country. This signifies that migration plans are flexible and even from abroad, and after years, migration mental equations can change and diaspora's behavior is adaptable. On the other side, it emphasizes that trust in the government is a key element in this case of north-north migration. Concerning the remittances, sending patterns of the new migrants, our paper is in line with Faini's analysis, highlighting that the volume of the remittances is not a direct function of the migrant's socio-economic condition in the destination country. Irrespective of the migrants' affluence, expatriates will remit less when this socio-economic support is not critically needed by the family. In addition, and contrary to the new economics of labor migration, the new Greek emigration does not seem to be taking place as an outcome of collective decision-making by extended families as part of a family planning that involves that some members of the household stay in the place of origin and other migrating and remit. Furthermore, remittances are not part of their initial migration planning, and the migrants are not expected to send money back home, in contrast to earlier migration waves. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In a sense, my paper reaches some similar conclusions to what the previous speaker has elaborated upon, although the way I go about it's quite different. Okay, my topic is, I would like first to thank the organizers for this very most interesting conference, and of course for allowing me to add my views. Remittances have been the hallmark of migration. They're not the only reason people migrate. They've been so important. World Bank figures released 2 or 3 weeks ago show that in 2017 remittances reached $613 billion US dollars, which was an increase of 7% from the previous year. India is the prime country that receives money, 60 billion, followed by China, another 40. One would expect that somewhat a similar pattern of people sending back money once they've moved in another country would also take place in the context of countries that have been facing economic crisis. And in particular, those 6 European countries mostly affected, that is Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Cyprus, and Ireland. However, World Bank figures say differently so. So there's a table starting in 1990. Greece is in the first column, but if you go a bit further, you can see that, say from 10, when the crisis really starts to be felt, at least as far as Greece is concerned, and while all other countries show rather an increase, it's not the case for Greek remittances. They go down. True, World Bank figures sometimes are erratic, cannot be explained. We don't know really what is behind them, but you know, it's the best guess we have on that. So it's something to consider, I think. On the other hand, it would appear that if indeed the number of emigrants is the one usually referred to in the press, also in the literature, almost reaching 500,000, the gap would have been even greater. However, Eurostat also a couple of weeks ago released some preliminary data on the numbers of European Union members from member states that work in another member state. And again, Greece does not figure out as the preeminent country of migration within the European Union among the countries of the crisis. Ireland is. And furthermore, the increase is rather minimal. It's 6% of its workforce, that is those aged 18 to 64. And in the previous measurement, which took place in 2012 as well as in 2007, it was 4.7%, which means that there is a slight increase of 1.4%. Now, if we translate this into numbers of people, it means that overall, these are total numbers, there are about 600,000 Greeks in other European Union countries, among which stands out Germany, that already had 300,000 and something before the crisis. So we're actually talking about a net immigration of roughly 140 to 150,000 people. And given that the so-called new Greek migration is basically a European phenomenon, the number of people that have moved to work abroad is is much less than what so often it is alluded. And you know, this Eurostat data are the best we can get, for good or evil. So again, we have an indication that things might not be as they usually appear, as it's usually argued. Two other issues emerge from this latest data set. The one is that the educational level attained by Greek immigrants is slightly more than the one available back in Greece. So while the average in the country is 29.5%, implying TE degrees as well, those who have a higher university degree, those that are in other European countries are just 2 decimal points beyond that, 31.5%. So there is definitely immigration. They're a bit more educated, but not the masses that leave the country out fresh from the universities to find work. The other thing is that those that go from Greece to other European countries are by far those that actually seek out and get gainful employment. They're about almost 20 decimal points beyond any other European country sending its own people within Europe. So obviously people emigrate for various reasons, but of course for financial ones as well. So this is a general picture. It creates some bizarre things, needs some explanation. I don't have a full explanation. And I switch now to a survey that I did a couple of years ago among interviews with 232 Greeks living in other European countries and working there, all of them. Mind you that almost 10% of them were actually working in the Gulf region, so you can take them out. Now, this is the distribution of my sample on the basis of their education criteria. As you see, the bulk of them have a master's and a PhD. This obviously relates to the way the sampling took place. It was a snowball sample. I also used Facebook groups in which I became a member. Then I was asking them to participate, and some did. And apparently, those that did were of a higher education background. But that's that. Obviously, my sample is not representative in some sense. Let me be clear about it. But we do have certain patterns emerging, which I think are quite interesting. And I've divided my sample on the basis of the educational criteria as A, B, and C profiles. The number A are those that are PhD candidates or have a PhD and a master's degree. Those B are those that have a first degree. And C are those that have less education. Now, what is the social composition of this particular group? Well, the social composition interesting or uninteresting enough, is preeminently middle class. And this has been gauged on the basis of looking at parents' professions, level of education their parents have achieved, attendance of private or public schools, home ownership, area of domicile, and such like. I've used this descriptive ninefold criterion: an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class. It's divided by 3 different gradients, and it appears that there was only one that could be identified as upper middle class. The bulk of the people I was interviewing belong to what can be described as a lower middle class. Now, interesting enough, about half of my sample acknowledged receiving assistance from their relatives when they moved abroad, either for study purposes initially or to set up themselves in the new environment. In a few cases, they even acknowledged receiving assistance, financial assistance every now and then. But that was an early thing, and it's obvious that the families did help a lot in their setting up abroad. The remaining, almost 52%, acknowledged receiving assistance, but of an informal kind, of a soft kind, by people that were not directly related to them, friends of friends, Facebook groups, colleagues they just knew, and so on. As far as social ties abroad, a significant number acknowledge having relatives or friends or other acquaintances, almost by 2/3. So, well, we already know that people do not just move from one country to the next without any links. It's just confirmed.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Remittances. Out of my 232 interviewees, a little more than a quarter, 27.5%, acknowledged receiving, sending back money, while the bulk, 72%, said they did not. This, I gather, is just a clear indication that those left behind are in a position to cater for themselves. So the issue is, if they are, why do they send or allow or encourage their offsprings to go abroad? And you know, there's sort of a discrepancy. To my understanding, from the more qualitative aspects of the interviewing, I think that what is taking place is for a large, substantial part of my interviewees, and again I should stress that this is not in some form representative, is that going abroad is an individual type of decision, a rational one, as rational one can be, which receives the support of the family, but it's not initiated out of the need to survive. That was the case for a small part, indeed, but not for most of those that go abroad in my sample. And obviously going abroad is considered to be part of a career, which is a preeminent middle class idea, building a profile and waiting for the right moment to return. When's the right moment? Do you intend to go, you return back to the country after, at some point in the future? The general response by all involved was, I would definitely like to go back in some indeterminate future when things improve, at least after 5 or 6 years and so on. Given that most of those educated have some form of career, of a more bright one or a less one, but they do have a career, I think that they actually operate as an unintended consequence of the whole thing, as a sort of a reproduction mechanism for part of the middle classes. They can diffuse some of the pressure of having employment or rightful employment that is sufficient for them in the home country, given the crisis. They can build a career and hope and wait to return back at some opportune moment. Here I've linked my sample on the basis of education profile with classes. And you can see that it's clearly, those most educated belong here mostly, and those less but having a first degree belong here, which is a lower level. And those that have less education are basically lower upper class. And then I've made an effort to link this to remittances. But, alas, I had to depart to go to another country before coming to Britain for about 10 days. So I didn't have the time to put everything on paper in numerical terms. But this is a very rough indication of how things would be for those reporting that they have received money, that they are sending money back home. And these are just a,
1 minute.
Yes, it's just a fraction, as you might recall, of the total. And again, these are concentrated mostly to the socially, those that are socially in lower positions. Okay, so let me sum it up. I think that remittances remain a major expression and outcome of migration. However, in the case of Greek emigration in European Union countries, it's clearly much less than one would have expected for reasons that are not clear. But this is sort of counterintuitive, of course. It implies that the families of migrants are in a position somehow to cope with the expenses and the crisis itself, the make ends meet, And I think that the higher the education level, the better prepared is someone to find gainful employment in other European countries. Obviously, there is a link here with the discussion on the brain drain, given the substantial amount of highly educated among my sample. This leads the inquiry on the rationale that may be identified that lies behind the decision to emigrate and the decision and assumptions underlying it. So, all in all, I think that here we have a set of indications, not something definitely, which, however, it's useful to bear in mind in having in further research in this area. Okay, that's it.
Many thanks for having me here. It's very refreshing to be able to talk to a room that contains so few pension experts. So we can actually talk about what is really important.
I thought you were going to say pensioners.
That's another issue. Right. Right. Now, for those of you who are not technically inclined, this little graffito by Banksy, I think, sums it all. I mean, it's an umbrella which actually concentrates the rain inside the umbrella rather than outside. So, and the way that the pension systems treat migrants, in a way, I think it's summed up by this picture, because what is not said is frequently more important than what is said. And what I've tried to do is to provide some kind of a think piece about this shifting equilibrium between migration and pension systems. So the average citizen in the advanced countries really has two major assets in his portfolio. One is the family home, and the other is the right to pensions. Now, both are supposed to function as bridges in between life cycle stages of people. And the interesting thing is that the value of both of these things in the last few years in Greece, but also in other countries, has proved to be highly contingent. There have been very large changes in rights, in asset prices, land, and...
Switch the lights.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that, either you will read or we have...
But I can read it from the...
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Now, both act as bridges and both are contingent. And the thing about international migration is it severs links with both. I mean, both with the family home, and creates problems about accessing essentially one's life savings. When we track how pension systems are treating the migrants, it's really an interplay between the dominant logic of the pension systems and the prevailing characteristics of migration. And what I'll try to do is try to an overview of past, present, and future of the portability of pensions. Start off with some pension system, look through the past, which was a case of largely reacting and treating migration as something which, treating pension rights of migration, not of the rights of people leaving, but securing pensions of those coming back, which is a very different point. So the umbrella is not really supposed to address the needs of those working, but those who have retired. And I'll try to conclude with some things about some observations about the future and about how pensions can actually entitlements can actually be used to manage the effects of migration. Now, some pensions can be seen in three different ways. In all countries, these three different ways coincide. Firstly, they can be seen as insurance, part of longevity planning and part of savings. And then they can be seen as prolongation of employment, so which is the classic case of the civil service. And finally, they can actually be seen as social policy, so meeting the rights of people who cannot, meeting the needs of people who cannot work. And the latter is usually linked to residence. The state is very frequently heavily involved in pensions, and the thing about it is it's rather ironic in that the theoretical arguments that the state uses to assume for itself responsibility for pensions, i.e. the people are myopic and they don't really know how to plan, are exactly the problems that the state itself generates in managing the pension system, and I think Greece is a particular case of this. Now, and all three systems can be involve both the state and the market, and it's very important in the case of the individual planning, because what we have in the case of migration is people taking responsibility for their own lives. So it's very important for them to know who is doing what. So what is the grammar between the three systems, the three logics of pension systems? And the worst thing for an individual perspective is not to be clear about what is doing what, because in that case, the responsibility left to the individual is essentially the whole lot. Right, so the evolving pension landscape. Greece has an interesting pension history, is that ICA was passed just a few months before US Social Security, and that's why they actually look quite similar. The original ICA law and the US Social Security law are very clear that there's kind of state-of-the-art 1930s League of Nations systems, and they, as we know, they evolved in very different ways. The Greek system fragmented and was essentially used as an instrument in clientelistic politics, so people selling influence. And all three pension logics persist in Greece, and they're used in clever ways by people to manage the system. So we see, for example, the social insurance logic is that pensions are our own money, please keep away from them. You also have the employment logic, saying that we deserve good pensions because we worked a hard line of hard work. And the social needs, because my needs must be met because my needs are greater than anybody else's. So at the same time, we have a patchwork, because the way the system developed left, because it reacted to questions set by particular groups. It was always a very heavily corporatist ideology. Meant that there were a lot of gaps left, which were in effect served by the family, which always played the part of an invisible fourth pillar. which was actually so what we had is a system where it provide a la carte solutions to ad hoc problems. Pension reform was a sort of very long-running affair, started in the 1950s, it was always pending, and it was finally imposed with a vengeance in a very long-running pension reform lasting from 2010 to 2019. So at the end of 2019, we'll actually have a new pension system, and I'll see what this pension system is. Now, the past, we have the different phases of post-war migration. Now, the interesting thing is that it was always the pension problems of migrants were always seen as problems of people migrating or coming back to Greece. Almost never did we think of the pension rights of people leaving. So there was, and also there were always reactions to problems which were always seen as pressing. And in this way, and this was helped a great deal by the fragmentation of the system, the fact that you had all these different logics going, because that meant that particular groups could negotiate different deals for themselves. So we see similar situations being dealt in different ways in the pre-crisis period. So it's always presumed, incidentally, which was in common with the prevailing characteristics of the 60s and 70s, that international transfer of assets was something which was very dangerous, because you had exchange rate movements and you had inflation rates differences. So it was actually safer in a way to rely on the state. And this was something which was not only a Greek phenomenon, but it was shared by virtually every other advanced state. And as a result, the pension problems of the pre-crisis period where the Greek pension problems were met primarily by the state. Now, an interesting development is that after the 1990s, Greece became a destination country for migrants. So the problems that were met by Greek migrants, for example, going to Germany, were met by foreign workers in Greece, and their needs were met or not met according to, again, corporatist logic. So, for example, Filipino sailors working on Greek ships are paying social security, but are accumulating no rights at all. Their money is transferred to Greek sailors. Now, another development, of course, is entry in the European community and the membership of EMU. That, on the one hand, eliminated the macroeconomic dangers, macroeconomic risks in transfers, and made the whole issue of a transnational career much more feasible than it used to be, and also made it possible to have a transnational career which evolved circular migration and repeated exits and entries. And finally, you also had the EU working as an overall umbrella, trying to sort out the free movement of labour, which, after all, is one of the 5 freedoms of the EU. So it was always something that was made. Now, in the periods before the crisis, we see all kinds of all 3 different logics of migration being addressed. Firstly, is we have the problem set by the returning diasporas. The one that the original one, and the one that took most time to negotiate because it was very drawn out, is the case of returning Greeks from Egypt, where the return was a drawn-out process which started after the Second World War and was more or less completed in the 1960s. Now, a similar situation of the people from the Caucasus was dealt in very different ways. I mean, there was seen simply as a social safety net issue, whereas returning Greeks from Egypt had the time to be offered a more complete package, recognizing rights and so on, enable them to set up shop in Greece. At the same time, you have the circular migration. So Germany was all directed by intergovernmental agreements. The first intergovernmental agreements I think was 1958 or thereabouts. And similar bilateral agreements were agreed by quite a lot of other, both EU and other states. The difference in the EU and the transcontinental migration was concerned more with the rights of returning pensioners rather than the current rights of workers, which was something that had to be dealt with in the case of Europe. The EU also, one of the longest running battles in the EU was the regulation about what is called the modernized coordination of social security system. This started off its life as Regulation 14, or Draft Regulation 1408 of 1971. It was finally passed in 2004 and became law in 2010. Now, the point about this is that it sets the free movement of labor as a target and tries to coordinate it, but it's battling against the fact that you have different logics of different pension systems in different countries. So it's like a moving target practice, because as the coordination is proceeding, the systems themselves are changing. And the point is that the systems are changing in a direction which makes the individual planning, in most cases, makes the individual planning of greater importance, and hence facilitates movement. Now, if one country decides to go against the flow, that will make this planning much harder. And this is the case of Greece. We had a reform at last in 2010, and we have a new system. But if we look at what kind of system we have, what essentially we have is a revamped 1960s type, very heavy, state-run pension system. So it's 100% state, and what it does, it has high contribution rates in order to secure relatively generous replacement rates down the road, which is exactly the opposite of what a migrating individual would want. One migrating individual would want help during the time that he or she is accumulating, and in order to be able to have a greater probability of getting a pension later on. My reading of the Greek system is that a system which is very heavy and tries to protect incumbents. It does so in a different way from the previous one, which was all relying on borrowing, but nevertheless, if you look at it from the individual point of view, it's a system which is not very friendly to international mobility, and is very much the sort of system that one would have chosen in the 1960s. And, well, what we legislated was a brand new anachronism, and the long review essentially solved the first generation problem of the Greek system, which was how to complete the process which started in 1934, but missed out completely the fact that you have to prepare for aging and longevity, and also to prepare for the sort of challenges of the 21st century, which are longevity, longevity means that there will be much greater responsibility on the individual to plan his or her future. We have the future of work, which is becoming much more globalized. So the spells of work in different jurisdictions, in my view, are becoming the norm rather than the exception. And finally, migration trends means that the hollowing out of work is happening at the two ends. We have migration at the bottom end, so people providing personal services, care services are very important. And but also at the same time we have migration at the top end. The point about Greece is that it seems, well, both Greece as a whole and pension matters in Greece seem to be stuck in a rut of path dependence. Now the point is, can we break out of it? Now, the things that, as longevity is becoming much more important, the state is taking on more and more responsibility for itself and renewed its commitment at a time when that commitment is not at all credible. Pensions are on paper still quite generous, but they're not safe. So you're given a pension promise that hardly anyone believes. Now, look at it the other point of view, what could we gain from pension portability? Now, there are two main areas where Greece is lacking. One is savings, and what we have already found is that migrants nowadays actually take capital with them. They don't send capital home, but my reading is that together with all the problems of investment in Greece, their parents invest in their own children's progress in the destination countries, giving money, either exporting money from Greece or using money that had already been stashed away because of the Brexit problems. Now, the second thing is that the process of migration means that something which is usually taken for granted in pension and not only discourse is actually, is treated as an exogenous, is actually endogenous. So the point is that we have this Greek diaspora. Now it's up to things like the pension system to actually try to attract these people back. Attracting these people back means that things like the cost of the labor force, dependency ratio, etc., become endogenous to the model and not just something you have to take for granted. So they're actually dependent on having a kind of pension system which makes it worthwhile for people to work to come home. So at the root of the problem is a pension system which refuses to deal as pensions as a capital asset and tries to secure flows of funds going to incumbents and current pensioners and sends the bill, whatever it is, to younger people working. Now, what can you do about it? We think, myself and some colleagues from Piraeus, we think that something can be done. We think that it is possible to come up with a fast transition to a three-pillar system in Greece. The point about the three-pillar system is that it gives priority to the young, and the name of the book that is going to be published very soon is actually called The Pensions for the Young. And it's got the Banksy cartoon on the cover. There was a graffito, I come back to a graffito which I saw in Chania. It was written by an anarchist, and they said, military service at 100, pension at the 18. So this is our goal in life.